Hi everybody, this is Greg Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Abby, who is a beginning photographer from California. Abby shot this with a Canon 40D, used an effective focal length of around 150 millimeters, and jumped the ISO up to 640 here to try and get to a higher shutter speed because of some subtle subject motion of the boat on the water. Abby gave us some great backstory information here in terms of letting us know what he was going for in the image, and we really do appreciate it when you share that kind of information with us on the Mindful Eyes image submission forms. Abby let us know that he specifically went to the Venice Canal area in LA to shoot these boats, and he was thinking about shooting them in more of an abstract way. Abby titled this image Tranquility. I want to talk more about titling in just a minute, but that gives us even more sort of a conceptual idea of what Abby wants the image to say. And under questions and comments, Abby makes a couple of interesting statements. One is that another part of the process in this particular shoot was to just shoot a couple of 3 images on each setup to try and work more on the idea of composing in the camera instead of taking a ton of images and kind of finding the image in the editing process. And that makes a lot of sense, particularly to me anyway, in a subject matter like this where it can be a lot more contemplative. The boats may be subtly moving on the water, but they're not totally going away. It's not like photographing a really dynamic situation like a person or something like that. And Abby has a question. He says, now that I have this single frame, I wonder whether I went in too close, whether it would have helped to include more negative space on the bottom left. So here's what I want to do on the critique today. I want to talk about practical stuff and get right into answering Abby's question about the composition. And then at the end I want to talk a little bit more philosophically about the creative process relative to several different things. One is becoming more conceptual, so shooting to a concept instead of reacting. The other is titling your work. And the other is the idea of setting some kind of a limit to actually become more creative, a little bit counterintuitive. We're going to do that last in case all you wanted was just sort of nuts and bolts stuff out of the daily critique. Because I know that Abby was thinking about more of an abstract image, and because of the title Tranquility, it starts to give me as the viewer more of a context to give feedback to Abby. Abby's asking me for feedback. And so if I'm thinking abstract and I'm thinking tranquility, instead of adding more negative space down here, and I'd love to, this is an image where I'd really love to be sitting with Abby and we're talking about it. I don't want to assume anything, but I'm sort of guessing that Abby may be thinking that more negative space down here might help to balance this top part of the image, because right now for me this part does have a lot of visual weight relative to the bottom part. Why is that true? You know, we talk about a visual hierarchy of things that draw the viewer's eye, and we tend to just talk about design elements that do that. We talk about the area or areas of highest contrast being the most visually heavy thing. Then we talk about warm colors versus cool colors being heavier. Then we talk about the idea of light drawing more of the eye than dark. But then we also have the psychological impact of things. And one thing that has a really big psychological impact on the viewer and takes on a lot of visual weight is when one thing is different than everything else. And it's interesting, you know, when I look at everything else besides that area of the image, I see something that's more abstract. What do we mean by abstract? We mean shooting a subject in a way where we pay more attention to the intrinsic form or color or line or shape. It does become more about sort of these inherent intrinsic qualities of something than describing the thing itself. This is very literal and very gritty and very documentary. This, on the other hand, is much more abstract and more just about line, shape, color, so on and so forth. And the other thing is that all of this down in here is very smooth, and this has a lot of texture. This is all potentially very peaceful. Psychologically, this, for a lot of people, me included, because I've had some nightmare experiences paddling a boat with other people, this starts to psychologically suggest all kinds of things that may not be peaceful at all. Just the idea of having to paddle the boat for some people, sitting and maybe in a way that's uncomfortable. 2 people and one knows how to paddle and one doesn't. One wants to go somewhere and one wants to go somewhere else, so on and so forth. And so this area to me inside of the boat just really has an enormous amount of visual weight. And instead of adding more down here to try and balance that out, because I know Abby's concept, and I know the title is Tranquility, and I know that we were going for something more abstract. I personally would say let's just take it away. Let's simplify this and let's come down into here somewhere. And I want to talk about the cropping in just a second, but I want to go ahead and just do sort of a fast crop and say, to me, this is much simpler. There's 3 ideas now from a design standpoint, which is fun. The square is more fine art, and this will hack a lot of people off. It always does every time I say it, but I have a real strong opinion about it, so I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. Black and white is 50 billion times easier than color. I can't overstate that. I'd say a higher number, but I can't think of one. And square is the easiest format to shoot in. Square is super easy. You can center your subject. Square is more fine art. You can get away with getting away from sort of traditional design a lot more in the square. It's just much simpler to begin with because you have a framing device that is incredibly simple. Much harder if we're trying to appeal to a lot of people to work in framing devices that are asymmetrical. And I like the square format, particularly if we're talking about a fine art approach. To me, this is obviously much more abstract. It's much more tranquil. And the other thing that's interesting to me is that in addition to now having 3 subjects, which is kind of fun, when we come down into this area, I start to feel the archetype of a dolphin, which also starts to suggest peace. It starts to have a psychological impact. It's very different than the inside of that boat. Just talking about the crop itself, you know, another crop that creates a much more complex image, but it's kind of fun to think about, is coming just to right there. And I'm looking at that line coming out of the right-hand corner and working one of the major diagonals, and also creating some tension right here along the edge. More complicated image, but having this bit of tension right here with all of this that's so peaceful and so smooth, kind of a neat counterpoint. It's a very different feeling image, but it's just you know, a variation to think about, and those are sort of the 2 crop variations in the most basic sense that I would think about. Love to hear your feedback about the practical part of the critique. Just a few comments about more philosophical, creative things. You know, to me, there's sort of 2 ends of the creative continuum when we're coming up with ideas. One is to react to things. You go out with your camera and something happens and you just react. Or maybe you go out and you get a little bit of an idea and you build around that. But you're basically riffing off of or reacting to the environment. The other would be to walk out and say, this is my concept, and now I'm going to pull together the things to make it happen. And I think both are very powerful, and there are also combinations of both of those processes in between. But to me, those are sort of sitting out on the end of sort of the creative continuum process. I love to work both, but the interesting thing is, I think the older that I get, the more I'm appreciating having an idea first, something that really motivates me, and then sort of shooting to that. And that's definitely happening in my songwriting process. It's another thing that I do to be creative. The other thing that's interesting is titling your work. I think it's very, very powerful. I think it helps to crystallize in our own minds what our images are about. It's another way to practice being creative. It helps us to build creative confidence. The more we put ourselves into a situation where we're coming up with ideas, and I think a better way of saying that is we're actually letting ideas come in. We're just accepting the ideas or being open to the ideas. We build confidence. To me, creativity is a belief system. The people that end up being the most creative are the ones that believe that they are creative and believe that they're surrounded by tons of ideas. And I think in a bigger sense, I think very, very creative people are people that know that the ideas are around them and moving through them and are available to them all the time. I think they believe in something that's much bigger than just their ability to do it on their own. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is the sort of counterintuitive idea of limits. Putting limits on your creative process, like Abby did here, just a few shots on each subject, is a way to be more creative. Sometimes when we have access to too much, that can fuel fear. We can start to say, God, I could do anything and I need to do something great, and so I don't know where to start. And when we start to make the box of possibilities smaller, and we can make it really small, we can say, okay, in the next minute I got to take 30 pictures. Obviously that gets us connected to the only place that great pictures come from, and that is actually being in the process of being a photographer. To become the highest vision that we want to become for ourselves, we have to be the person now that we want to become. It's very counterintuitive, but when we start to practice that, then that's where all of our great shots have always come from. big thank you to Abby for submitting a really beautiful image, and big thank you to all of you for being here. Hope to see you again real soon on the Daily Critique.